Deck building is extremely complicated in Flesh and Blood as compared to many other TCGs. It goes beyond simply getting your resource ratios correct, because, let's be honest, in general, resources trade off for performance. So the task is to maximize our power and value, while at the same time ensuring that we always have the resources that we need when we need them. So today's guest has taken on this task and constructed a raw model to predict the perfect number of blues for our decks. So join us today as we nerd out and talk numbers, theory, and what we need to get that perfect ratio. A huge shout out to our channel members for supporting what we do here. If you want to get involved with the channel and the Dice Commando community, please consider joining as a channel member. Remember, these videos are only possible with your support. You can show that support with a like, a subscribe, and by leaving us a comment and sharing your feedback. Community first, and go Commando. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dice Commando and a super special Go Again, a fabulous cast. And I'm super excited about this one because we get to nerd out with a fellow engineer. And today we're joined by Nathan Crawford, who's going to nerd out with us on numbers and stats with the goal of making sure we always have the resources that we need when we're doing our deck building. So, welcome, sir. How are we doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on. And any chance that I can talk about numbers and math outside of work, I always take up the opportunity for sure.
Well, rest assured, there's like 7 people out there right now who are super interested in what you have to say. So,
oh, absolutely.
Andrew Osman, give a shout out. I know he's going to be leaving comments like crazy, but no. So for those of, I feel that there's very few people in the Fab community who don't know who you are. But with that said, why don't you take the opportunity to let folks know who you are?
Sure. So I am a team member of the Card Guys, Flesh and Blood team, and I've been playing the game since probably Monarch, I would say, is when I hopped on kind of that first big boom in the US when everybody went from Blitz to CC. That's kind of when I jumped on board. So not an OG, but close enough. And I've been enjoying the game. I dabbled in a little bit of content, kind of stuck with it. And I've just enjoyed kind of my whole content creation journey has just been a big way of just taking information that took me a really long time to learn and breaking it down for people. And I've just been trying to do that as good as I can.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you already kind of spilled the team affiliation, so you're a member of the TCGs, as the community, or at least as I know it, but the Card Guys. But why don't you tell us about that and your buddies and what you all do?
Yeah, so we're just a bunch of guys that just love to play the game of Flesh and Blood. We love hanging out. It's myself, Josh, Ed, Will, and then you have the newer guys, Taylor and Aaron. And yeah, we just love the game of Flesh and Blood. We like making content, and most importantly, we just like that content that has the vibe of just us hanging out and just having fun with it, not making it super serious. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we got to break stuff down, but for the most part, we're there to have a good time and hope people both get entertainment and value from it.
Yeah. Well, I think people certainly do. I mean, obviously, Josh is the poster child for, Warrior, but I think you yourself have made, I've heard certain people say, the voice of competitive Flesh and Blood, which is rough because we've got, your counterparts down on the other side of, almost exactly on the other side of the planet, if we were to draw the line, with our Arsenal Pass brothers. But, I think you've made quite a name for yourself, which I think feeds into my next question for you, which, well, maybe not question, but props for, I think when you did casting at the recent event was really, really, really well done. I very much appreciated it. I think you did a really good job. So can you, tell us about that experience? That's a big deal.
Well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate it. And as for the experience, it was actually what I would consider the perfect weekend of Flesh and Blood. I got to play the calling. I made day 2, made a somewhat deep run to like 19th place, got to just enjoy the game and then take that Sunday to cast the Battle Harden. I mean, it was like all the wickets just checked off in one weekend, and it was a blast. I had an amazing time. A lot of people, said that I seemed to be a little bit of a natural at it, although I stream, so it kind of a lot of that stuff carries over. And then like I mentioned before in our conversation, I was a meteorologist for 7 years, so a lot of that, I don't have the nerves that a lot of people have to overcome in that situation. And I relaxed, had a good time, held back on the jokes a little bit because I didn't want to push it too much. But
It's
it
probably
is what it is.
probably smart given some past history of
Yeah,
Flesh and Blood casting. It's probably smart.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah, that no, it's fair enough. But I thought you did a really good job, and also having you in the role of the quote unquote technical caster in that point, I think was the not the color commentator as the kids say these days or whatever. But I think you did a really good job. I enjoyed that whole event. But yeah, that is a good point that you got to play that weekend as well. So you were coming off already brain fried, and you still nailed it. So
We take it.
Stuck the landing, as they say. Fair enough. So, all right. So, kind of the overall of tonight, as I mentioned in the intro, but what we are talking about is your calculator, which is the perfect amount of blues for a person to run. So, as we get into this discussion, I want to set the ground floor. Could you please? We're going to use the term hypergeometric calculator at least several times during tonight's discussion. So, could you please bring folks up to speed? What is a hypergeometric calculator? What does that mean, and like why?
Sure. And so a hypergeometric calculator, which is really just a really fancy way to show probability distribution in a certain manner. And the main value that we actually get from it is it does not actually replace the sample that is drawn. And I'll give you an example of that. Basically, if you had a 60 card deck and you wanted to see the chances of drawing something, and you draw one card. Well, now you have a 59 card deck minus the card that you drew. And if you used any other probability like binomial distribution or something like that, it would throw that back in there and then redistribute it, and you'd get your standard deviations and things like that. But hypergeometric, the value in it is it does not add that back. So then the second card in your hand is drawn out of 59 minus that to factor in the probability, and then it combines all four cards into what is the probability to draw what you're trying to acquire. A very common misconception, though, is with hypergeometric calculators that it continues to go all the way through the 60 cards, and that is not the case. It stops at your sample size, and that is it. So a lot of people think that, I'm going to maintain that 90% as I draw my entire deck, and that's just not how it's going to work. So very important to distinguish that.
No, I appreciate that, and it's almost like you read the show notes and you're skipping ahead. The assumption within the model is essentially a constant shuffle, right? Right. I mean, exactly. Replacement with constant shuffle, which will play into skipping ahead bloop, bloop, on pitch stacking, and my questions for you on that. So fair enough. So what I'm going to do at this point actually is I'm going to go ahead and bring up the calculator, and I would appreciate it if obviously folks don't know this yet, but there is a link below. They already saw that, don't worry. There's a link below that they can click on to get to this. But if you could go ahead and walk us through and kind of talk me through it as well, so I can make sure I'm clicking on the right boxes, kind of talk us through how to use this and what the kind of end goal is here.
Sure. So I guess to start things is, what is the calculator trying to answer? Or why was it developed? And we did talk about the hypergeometric calculator, and to be 100% honest, it actually does leverage that exact tool inside the formulas. It just edits it a little bit. And the best example that I can give is when I was starting out. This is my first TCG, and everybody was like, "Oh yeah, you got to use the hypergeometric." That's what Josh would always tell me, and I would be like, "Okay." So I plug in the numbers, do all that, and it would say 89%, and I would be like, "Okay, is that good? Is that bad? Is that what I want? Do I want 93? Do I want 97? What are we trying to acquire here?" And another good example of that that's really just low to the ground is like temperature, right? Somebody's asking you, how do I need to grab my coat? And you tell them, imagine you tell a 5-year-old that it's 60 degrees outside. Well, that doesn't tell them whether they should grab their coat unless they're, 20 years old and they've had 15 years worth of feeling this temperature and that temperature, and they have a way to associate that to actually extract value from that statement. And so
that's pretty insightful. For I know I'm interrupting, but that's pretty insightful.
Yeah.
But carry on. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so like that's the best way that I can explain it, is that, you know, the number by itself gives nobody any value except for the players that, let's be honest, probably don't need that value. And so I had the discussion with Josh. I was like, Josh, how many blues are we running in Dory? And he goes, 23. And I was like, how'd you come up with that? And he goes, well, I've drawn about 10,000 hands. And I was like, okay, that's a fair point. But like, how do I know that without drawing 10,000 hands?
That's the question. That's with his 80 though, right? That's not his actual like main deck, right?
He fluctuates between 21 and 23 is like his standard. On average in a CC deck. And so I basically tried to get it out of him. I was like, what are you basing that off of other than years of experience? And he basically couldn't tell me. He basically leveraged the temperature analogy where we just grow up understanding what 70 degrees feels like versus 60, but without that experience, you don't know those values. And so all this tool, circling back, all this tool does is it takes that 87% or that 90% or that 95% and tells you if it's right. That's all it does. And so in the very bare bones of the calculator is a hypergeometric calculator, and that's what we'll see our first three values, or our first two values. That's the sample size and the cards in deck, right? At the very top left. And that's basically the basis for your hypergeometric calculation, where we have sample size, that's how many cards you're drawing, and then the cards in deck to know how many to pull from. But then we take it a step further, okay? And just to make sure, we're going to go ahead and just start digging into it, right?
Just rip off the Band-Aid, buddy.
Just rip it off. All right, here we go. We're going in. All right. So what we're trying to associate is how much, so the actual output of the calculator is showing you how much value you lose over the course of a game by running X amount of blue cards. Mm-hmm. That is the ultimate result of the function. And that's why if you scroll down a little bit, the number of blues, all those little lines in the graph at the bottom, your best solution is actually the lowest number. That is your answer. And
20,
that's what is
20,
highlighted.
In this particular case, it looks to be 20-ish.
Yeah. Exactly. And I have it highlighted above where it's 21. Yep. And so that's what we're actually solving for, is what's the minimal amount of value that we lose by running those blue cards. And the way that we do that is, first we set up an average value loss by not drawing a blue card, which if we scroll back up, is the third, should be the third input. And
value loss, no blue, number 4.
Yes, okay. And there's no like scientific answer here. All it is I simply goldfish whatever deck that I'm playing.
Mm-hmm.
I draw, just playing by myself, I just draw like 10, 12 hands. And I look at the hand and I say, what if I didn't have a blue? What's the optimum amount of offense I can produce with a blue or without a blue?
Mm-hmm.
And that delta, or the difference, is going to be that number. Okay.
And is it based on because like, let's say I'm a Guardian and I'm running Nothos, right? And I draw an all red hand. I can still throw 4 offensively. So you mentioned that it was based on what offense you could put up, but you could still technically block 9. So how are you rectifying that?
Yes, and then that was the hardest part to actually answer in the calculation. And that's what happens when we go to the very next value. The very next thing is called the tempo multiplier. Now, this is going to be a value between 0.5 and 1. And you can use a value in between. That's perfectly fine. But I've found the best results either using 0.5 or 1. And basically, all that number is do you have the opportunity to block? If you have the opportunity to block, the value is 1. That's going to tell the calculator to give more weight to, if we go to our blue section, it says average block value for blues. in kind of that bottom right section where it basically just, or it's at the top left as well. It allows us to leverage the value from that average. Whereas if you're in a matchup where, say, you're playing against Florian, right? And Florian is kind of like sitting back doing his own thing, you're not going to be able to extract that value from your blues in that manner. It's just going to be impossible. He's not going to be attacking you.
Right.
You may be able to block with one if you're lucky. So that's how that is factored in, and that's a very important aspect of it as well.
So if I can summarize real quick, just to make sure that I'm aligned, what you're saying is, like, let's say I get a hand of all blues in a non-guardian state. Like, it's like get a hand of all blues where I don't need them. I can still get 3 value out of said blues. And what you're saying is, like, in the Florian or whatever they're hanging back, I wouldn't actually be able to get that value. I'd have a stuck hand. Is that a correct?
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
say you're playing any deck and you draw 4 blues. We'll just use Bravo because it's a good example, right? If you're playing against Aurora, that hand will always convert
Right.
to 13 value because you'll block 9 and swing 4.
Right.
Or 12 if you want to block with all of them. But if you're playing against Florian, it's probably going to convert to 7. So basically you might be able to block 1 card tops, maybe pitch for some rune chance, and then you swing back, right? So that tempo multiplier is going to change how the block value is weighed, is basically what it's doing, is manipulating that. So it's basically saying, okay, sure, your average block value is 2.86, but in all reality, it's probably going to be closer to 1.43, which is half of the value, because that's how much you're going to actually be able to get out of it by blocking, even though you have a higher average block value.
I see. And then how do you budget for quote unquote non-consumable cards? So, like, let's say you do run into a pile of Rune Chance Florian and you can pitch all 3 of those cards. Since they're recyclable, you actually get more value out of that. How do you account for that? Or is that just impossible in a model like this?
No, it's actually not impossible at all. And the way that is accomplished is what I recommend people to do, how the optimal way to use this calculator is actually not to use it per deck, but per matchup. And so in a perfect world, you would take a deck, right? And say you had access to 23 blues, using the Dora example, right? And you would do all the math and say, okay, 20 is my number, so side 3 out kind of situation. And then but in the blue section, you have what's referred to as a pitch outlet, which would be what you're mentioning, right? You have a way to leverage value from your blues, either defensively or offensively, which a good example of that not blocking Rune Chance would be Grasp of the Arknight or an Aurora hero ability or something like that. And so that just the key though is it needs to be like on the board, not, oh, if I draw that 1 card in my deck, I have a pitch outlet. It doesn't really work that way. It needs to be on the board, easily accessible.
I see. The Grasp is actually a pretty decent example. Yeah.
Yep. And so what's going to do, and then the next 2 numbers are basically the same thing, just for different colors, right? And it's recovery rate and for blue and recovery rate for red. And basically what that's doing is it's telling you how much value you can salvage if you draw more than one of those cards. Okay? So in this example, the way it's basically stated in the percentages is and by the way, these are not changed. You don't type those in. This is a very complex number that you don't have to solve off the top of your head. This is derived from the stuff on the right that has the weights on them that are much easier questions to answer. And that's how the calculator is designed. I want you to make I need you to answer the easiest questions possible, not the most difficult. And so basically, if you have, just use an example, right? If you have access to a pitch outlet, if you have over curve outlets, right? Then your recovery rate on blues is going to be a lot higher because there is a higher probability to actually leverage them in some offensive manner, is kind of the idea, or block with them if you have good block values. is kind of the idea. And then you also have people that literally cheat the system by average blue offensive value, aka MST. That's basically a MST weight is essentially what it is. Where basically your blues are reds and that's why you run them. It's not because of math or anything like that. It's literally just because they're as good as red cards.
I don't understand what you're talking about right now.
Yeah, who would have thought? Who would have thought? But so how those are calculated is we'll break down the red one first. And a lot of the stuff is very, very self-explanatory, right? Tunic recovery, right? If you draw a lot of red cards or all red cards, then having a tunic counter, depending on your cost curve, if you're in Bravo, it's not going to help you at all.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're, playing a deck like Dory or something like that, it can help, right? It does alleviate some pain in some form.
Well, we're playing courage. We're playing courage anyway. Come on, what's this tunic?
Or you could just make it free, right? Yeah. And then you have average red cost, which is where basically most of your weight is applied, and that's very self-explanatory, right? It's like the average cost of all your red cards. And it's very important to distinguish. It's not just red cards. If you notice on the left, I define reds as cards you want to play. Just a little bit lower. Basically just defined reds and blues. Whereas reds are not necessarily red stripes, but cards you actively want to resolve. So to give you an example,
Arc Lightning would be a red in this model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Same thing for Rouse the Ancients, right? Like that is a blue card.
Oh, good point. Okay.
But it's like a really good card to actually resolve. And so I count those as red cards. So when you're doing your average red cost, make sure to factor in those cards. It's any card that you're actively, like when you draw it, you're like, yeah, how do I play this? And if that is your thought process, you need to add it into the calculation. And the higher that number is, right? If you have an average red cost of 3.6, you're going to need more blues, right? And it's pretty self-explanatory there. And then action point availability essentially reduces the ability or reduces the value lost from drawing multiple reds, right? And the very simple explanation of this is like if a ninja draws 4 cards and they're all red, you lose 0 value because you're just going to slap them all in the combat chain and be done with it, right? Because every one of them has printed go again on it. But decks like Aurora, it can be a little bit iffy. It's not as straightforward, and you can lose some value. And then obviously decks like Guardian and stuff like that, you're going to have a really hard time converting those on the basis of action point availability.
No, I mean, to your Aurora point, I've definitely drawn a 2 Lightning Surge, 2 Flittering Charge hand before. It's absolutely happened to me, right? So I hear you.
Yeah, it happens all the time. It happens all the time. But then you go to blues, and you have average value. Obviously, we already went over the block, and then we basically went over all of these. But to give you a good example of the bottom one, the over curve outlet, that is basically. What are some good examples? Pummel, Overpower, and Dory. Not just any reaction, right? Because Dory wants to operate on a curve, right? You have to identify your deck's optimal curve. In Dory, it's always pitch one blue card. Dory's never like, oh man, I really want to pitch 2 blues. That's usually not how Dory wants to play her turn. She can, but it's not the optimal strategy. And whereas Dory has access to cards like Overpower, where she can dump a whole blue and actually get some value from it, depending on the color. But the important part is, in that sentence, I said, allow you to play efficiently over the natural curve of your deck. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that's the very important distinguish. So if you can pitch 3 blues and pump and exude, maybe that's not worth counting, because it's not, you're only getting 2 value from it.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a good example. Yeah, I see. Got it.
And so basically what happens after that, once you apply all the values, and we can actually peel back the onion one more layer and actually get into the math and how these actually kind of came together and ended up actually working. When I first developed the model, I had a little bit of a problem where it would fail if I went on either side of 15 to 24 blues. So basically the model
So you're
works,
saying 15 being your LCL and 24 being your UCL, right?
exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I was on either side of those, it had an extremely high failure rate.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically the model was accurately predicting any deck that wanted to draw 1 blue. But anything outside of that,
I see.
it was just bad. Like, it did not work. So I thought to myself, I said, how do I fix that? And what I ended up doing was breaking down the math and creating an artificial global maximum at 1 blue, and then skewing the weights on both sides to skew the data away from 50%. And so it had a really high success rate when the math was weighed appropriately. And then I just aggressively changed the weights to go as far away from 50% as I possibly could. And the way that I did that was I basically adjusted the hypergeometric calculator and added a default loss value to the blues. So basically what I did was I gave the base value of a red of 4, right? But if you take any red card in Flesh and Blood and take its blue counterpart, it's worth how much less?
2. Yeah, 2. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the math actually fixed the entire calculator by just building that into it, because then it just really aggressively changed the weights and how they responded. And then during my stream, when I actually showed it, I did an Aurora deck, I did a Dory deck, I did a Bravo deck, and I even did a Zen deck, which is kind of like all 3 are on all spectrums of what blues they want.
I don't even want to know how you did the Zen deck with, but
so what I did,
I mean, I actually do, but my point is I can't conceptualize how you did it. That's what I meant, but go ahead.
It was actually a very easy solution. It was just count the cheat cards as red cards.
Oh.
Because the cheat card, you're pitching to go get a red card.
Oh, but that only, so then do Enigma.
Right. And then that's where it gets
got it.
And so that's where you have to go. With the MST, you do have to think a little bit outside the box. It's not as straightforward. But she luckily has a lot more pitch outlets, right? She has ways to, either swing with an entire board, or she can create spectral shields. She can do a lot with the blue, which is why she runs like 36 of them. And that's kind of like 36 to 30 is kind of the default for all MST heroes. But a lot of that has to do with the blues are just good. And it's not really a
turns out problem. When your blues are the same as reds, they're pretty good. Yeah, go.
Yeah, who knew?
No, fair enough. That's actually really interesting. With Enigma, did you maybe let me change the question. How did you model non-consumable blues?
Can you give me an example?
Well, Enigma, like she can just pitch to herself, create something that can attack, that can also block, and it goes back into your deck.
So what I would do in that situation, or what I ended up doing, and once again, this is like Illusionist is actually the biggest flaw of the calculator. It's not perfect by any means, obviously.
Are you saying that Illusionist breaks math? Is that what you're saying?
It literally does. It literally does. And so what I ended up having to do to work with Illusionists, especially ones with pitch outlets, Prism's not actually that difficult, because she kind of plays in the bounds of what's actually trying to happen. And in 75% of her deck's yellow anyway, so there's no really point of this calculator, to be honest.
Right. Yeah. Same with I wasn't even going to ask about Dramai. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, exactly. And so basically what I did was I put the pitch outlet weight from 0.1 and jacked it up to 0.3 is what I ended up doing, because I basically kept drawing Enigma hands, and there was always a way to leverage the blues, whether it was, play a mirror guy, or just there was some way to manufacture value from a blue card in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And it did not have to be defensive, which is why I did not even mess with the average defensive value of the blue cards. And another way that you could also do it is by increasing the offensive value, depending on if it's a more tempo oriented Enigma list. And the reason that I built it this way, I could have made it very simple and not had it check in as many cells. I could have not added the weight section and been a little bit easier. But I did that so people could kind of play around with it a little bit and just change the weights. The entire sheet is smart. It's checking for all the boxes. So literally, if you change it, it's going to update everything around it, and you don't have to. You can always start back from scratch if you go too far with it. No harm, no foul. And so I encourage people to, as they come up with these situations, play with it a little bit, change some values, see what happens.
Mm-hmm. No, makes sense. Makes sense. All right, so I mean, I think you might have already touched this already, but hypergeometric calculator models are very preferred for card games, as you mentioned earlier, because of the non-replacement factor, right? And we've already acknowledged that it's with a constant shuffle model, and I think that's really interesting in Flesh and Blood, particularly because of our very unique ability to quote unquote pitch stack. Right. The fact that we can, use the value on a blue, so to speak, but yet it comes back around later. And I do want to acknowledge, the shuffling portion of it. I get it. So how do you think that interferes with the actual math probability model? And I know that you have a bunch of columns in there, which I think is very valid. So talk us through that and how you're trying to kind of recover, quote unquote, the value of a pitched blue.
So that's actually very interesting because it's something that's very difficult to quantify from a mathematical standpoint. And when I released the calculator to the public, that was actually a lot of questions around that. Like, how do you factor in draw discard with brute, and how do you?
No.
Yeah. What about loading an arrow for ranger? There's so many different questions that I got that but if you really break all of those things down, the best thing that I would suggest is it statistically relevant? Right? And that's kind of the basis for the question. And I'll use the brute as an example, and then I'll answer your question. But if you have to play a card and pitch 2 reds, and then you draw a discard looking for a blue, do you want to count that 5th card? Probably not.
I would agree with that statement. Yeah,
because you're not achieving the state of drawing a blue card for the purposes you're calculating. And then in reverse,
yeah. But I mean, if you take a Bare Fangs, it's built in. But I'm just countering the arguments you'll get on this cast. But yeah, I actually agree with you. I just want to be clear. But go ahead.
Yeah,
please.
yeah. And then if you flip it into reverse, well, do you discount the what if you draw a second blue and you can't leverage it? And I would counter that argument with the probability to draw that card.
That's fair.
You're discarding a random card, right? So it could also be that card. So how do you factor that in? And so it really, this statistical relevance of the question is very important, and that's when we get to actually pitching. And all we're trying to do is build a deck. We're not trying to figure out how to play the deck. We're not trying to figure out what to do during turn 13 or 8 based off of what has already happened. So I would beg the question of what is the value of calculating what's been pitched into the calculation when we're trying to get the perfect starting place.
Okay, but that's an interesting jumping off point then, right, to kind of my next topic, which is if we're only looking at starting point, why do we need hypergeometric? Why not just do raw ratios?
Well, hypergeometric is the raw ratio, is it not?
No, but I could just say, I have 13 out of 60, my, PNR, right? Or whatever, my probability, whatever, whatever you learned in school, like my probability of draw with no replacement is, PNR, I think is the right statement. Probability no replacement is, whatever based on 13 of 60 or whatever it may be, right? You can say, well, my first 4 should look like this, so be it. right? So why the advance? To be clear, we're talking because I agree with your model. I'm just playing.
No,
I'm playing the counter argument here.
Of course.
If we're saying that it falls apart as the game goes on, why can't I just look at my raw ratios? That's the question, I guess.
Absolutely. And the answer to that question would be basically how many hours would you have to play the game of Flesh and Blood to acquire the knowledge to make that decision and make it accurately? Would be the question I would beg to ask, because every deck's going to be different, right?
But at a raw level, like let's say I'm playing Dorinthea, like so let's say I'm Josh Lau, right? I'm the most amazing warrior player in the history of all Warriors players. That's not true, but I love you, Josh. So I want 1 blue per hand, therefore I should have 25% blues in my 6-card deck. That's where I'm driving at. And that's obviously not a true statement. You want like slightly less than that, right? I mean, I guess not Josh, because he's playing 23, apparently. I don't know. but you get my point, right?
Right. But so to answer that question, what is the correct hypergeometric distribution to acquire 1 blue per hand? What percentage?
Honestly, it's probably like 13 out of 60 would be my just non-data-based guess. It's probably somewhere in that range.
But for that deck, is it? Because if you can leverage more value from your blue cards, then that number goes up. If you can't leverage value,
because I'm a warrior and I can block more. I see. That's fair, and that's why something like Aurora is only playing like 8 or 9, or maybe even slightly
the
less.
reason that Aurora plays blue cards is because the blue cards are better than copies.
They confuse, which is another question I have for you. But
exactly. But Aurora is like red cards stop at 51, and that's why they play blues. It's literally because they don't have better red cards, or the blue cards are so good that they're better than copies. 54 through 60.
But everyone's playing Heaven's Claws. Like I don't think people would argue that Heaven's Claws is better than a red.
Well, now that ideally a lot of people are only playing Heaven's Claw for the block value, right? That was kind of the main
fuse
driver.
in the block, yeah.
Right, and to be able to get another lightning card into the pitch zone. But if you had a red card that blocked 3 and it was lightning,
Heaven's Claws. That's why I brought that one up. Is Heaven's Claws does exist in that.
That is fair. So I mean,
that's why I brought that one up. I mean, it's not a 0, so I get the thing, but like you get my point, right? Yeah,
100%.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Go ahead.
That's a really good point, and it could have to do with synergies coinciding with like the Flicker Wisp Art Lightning combo, right? Needing the resources or a way to convert the resources, because I guess the differentiation is I'm talking about brand new Aurora with the new cards, whereas kind of Heaven's Claw was like pre-armory deck. I don't think a lot of people are on Heaven's Claw anymore. Because we kind of opened up with the I forget the name of the new blue,
the sky something or whatever.
Like that's infinitely better, right? It still blocks 3 and fulfills a lot of other things. But yeah, that is actually a very good point of why people were actually running Heaven's Claw over. There was some lists that didn't have Fry or Sizzle or things like that. So it's actually a really good point.
Well, not playing Sizzle I think was a mistake, but. You know what?
I agree.
I'm not winning callings, so I just work here, my friend. I just work here.
I think Sizzle's good.
I think I was playing Yellow Sizzle for a while, actually. A lot. So I know we're on total aside, but I took a lot of flack because I was playing in the early days. I was playing the mask, the Runeblade mask that you could, I forget the name. Of course I do in the moment, but it was the action, non-attack, and they'd have to discard and you could draw. Nightmares?
Yeah.
Is that right? No, that's news.
Yeah, Purgatory, right?
Purgatory, thank you. Yeah, Face Purgatory. So I was playing that, and people were like, oh, that's a horrible call. And I was like, well, I'm playing,
It's pretty good.
Yellow. I was playing Yellow Sizzle, and then I moved over to, whatever. Doesn't matter. We're off topic, so. No, so one thing I wanted to ping you on about is, since we're, at this point, anybody who's left, which is like 4 people, actually care about the stats. So, I do a fair amount of process, and that's an understatement if any of my employees are watching, which none of them are, hopefully. But I do a fair amount of process control in my job, and we generally assume that 95% is it's like, statistically it's actually like 99.7%, but that's not very realistic in terms of like actual like practical process control. So we generally assume that 95% confidence is reasonable. And anybody who's taken like Six Sigma and stuff understands that like a p-value of 0.05 is generally assumed as like fail no fail. So with that little diatribe aside, right, with that assumed as being the quote unquote rare event, which is not technically true, but is generally accepted in the industry, how do you account for that within your model? And then, do you account for a rare event via your model being 1% or 5%, or how is that, flushed out in your model in terms of like what your target success is? And let me back up a bit, because I might have gone a little too much on a rant there. So to boil it down, I would assume that coming into this, it's like, if I need one blue in my hand, like I'm Dorinthea again, right? I'm Dorinthea. I need a blue in my hand for my deck to work, right?
Right.
I should assume that I have roughly a 95% confidence of drawing what I need when I need it. I think that's a better way to say it. So how do you reflect that within your overall model?
So that's actually the beauty of the model, is it actually doesn't even need that to function. You don't need to calculate the confidence of it, because what it's actively doing is it may be optimal to run less blue cards and not draw one. That could be actually the optimal outcome, right? So the question that we're trying to answer is not what is the optimal chance to draw a blue card. The question we're answering is what is the
but
least
what I
amount
was
of
driving
value.
at is what is the 95% confidence of having what I need when I need it? That's the better way to state the question. Because that's what your model's driving at, right? Is do I have what I need when I need it, right?
Right. And as far as the 95% of what you have when you are,
I mean, maybe it's not
getting what you
95% in
want
your
when
model,
you-
but you understand my point.
Sure.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think on it, and I'm kind of stumped actually, because it just draws through. It literally just draws because the values are going to change, and there's also the fact that yes, the rare occurrence happens, right? So let's use an example. You're running 30 blues and you draw all reds. That would definitely be a rare occurrence, right?
Bravo's that's never happened to Bravo. Never.
Yeah, never ever.
Yeah.
And the question that I would ask for that situation is, in the game of Flesh and Blood, why it makes it such a difficult proposition to actually just break it down to a 95%, is there's so many ways to utilize those cards. It's
fair.
They don't have to be played on offense. They don't have to be pitched. Now, in a game of Magic, that is the easiest math problem in the world, because you literally, I mean, there's day two, somebody probably made an Excel sheet that said the exact number of lands and what colors to run, and somebody just did it while they were on break at work. I mean, the math is that easy. But in Flesh and Blood, there's so many different variables, so many different ways you can leverage cards that I don't think it's about just getting to that 95 or whatever you set it at. I really don't. But literally all the calculator is doing is just what is factoring in all those weights. How do you lose the least amount of value? And the most interesting part is it's never zero. You're always losing value. You're just trying to lose the absolute least amount.
So when you to that point, when you do a Syndra deck, what's it come out at?
It approaches zero.
Approaches zero. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it approaches zero technically.
Okay. Yeah. That's kind of what I expected. Yeah, it was like probably like 2 or something like that, right? Like you play Warmongers or something.
Yeah. And it's actually interesting because the hypergeometric won't calculate
Right.
below 4 because that is the sample size,
Oh.
and you
Oh,
can't.
oh,
The mathematical limit for the calculator is actually 4,
oh,
because
oh.
you can't say, oh, it's optimal to not draw less cards than I'm drawing.
Right, because you're setting the output as your success criteria. Yeah. I
Right.
see. Oh,
Right.
that's actually really interesting.
And it's actually the exact same on the other end. The limit at the top is 56, but if
Got
you're
it.
playing 56 blues, I don't know. You're playing a different game.
Cav Dane, baby. Cav Dane.
I tell you what.
Oh, that's really interesting. Good point. Thank you for bringing that in. That's
Yeah.
really good. Cool. All right, my friend. Well, we are well into this, and we've successfully nerded out at this point. So I want to start to sunset this, but first, I want to thank you. I was really excited about this, and I reached out to you like 2 days before I left for vacation, and then I hit you up like 10 days later, and was like, "Hey, bro, remember that conversation we had on Twitter 19 years ago?" And so I'm glad we were able to make this work, and I appreciate you being flexible with the time zones. So before we get out of here, do you have any shout outs to give or anything you want to talk about?
Sure. On Twitter at Nathan_TCGZ. And then I also do streams on the Card Guys YouTube channel every Wednesday night at 9 Eastern. I got to remember my own stream time. I've only been doing it 2 years, but we got it. I do that. I do some like tier lists and stuff like that actually end up being somewhat accurate sometimes. But that's where to find me. And thank you so much for letting me on. I do appreciate it.
So we do have to, with the tier list, we do have to give a story, like, because we all have to, we all have to eat our shame, right? Mm-hmm. Your tier list, you made like 3 or 4 days going into when you actually did the coverage, and like you fell on your sword at least 3 or 4 times during the coverage. You're like, I was wrong. Yep. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I know that there's people out there in the sphere who don't appreciate people being wrong. That actually they do appreciate being people wrong, because then they can yell at them. But You know what I mean? Like, I thought it was great. You're like, I think this is how it's going to go. And you're like, I was wrong.
And
every streamer's been there. I love it.
The best part about it was I admitted it, but I was actually right. Because if you look at Syndra today, I mean, out of 2 tournaments, I think 50 have been there in the callings, and only 3 have converted to day 2. 3 out of 50 Syndras, which is D tier in my books. I don't know about you.
No, I mean, the pilot was good. The deck builder was good, right? We have both those factors going in. It was also early, and people weren't expecting what to see. But now that we've normalized, people have got their reps in. Yeah, I think you can plant your flag. You're like, I did good, but it was just funny, because you're like, well,
but
everyone in this room was like, I don't know what the hell's going on.
I whiffed.
No, it was great. It was great, and you owned it like a man. And a lot of chest bump, or whatever the kids do these days. No cap, or whatever they say. I don't know. Whatever.
No cap.
All right, my friend. Anything else you want to talk about before we get out of here?
That's it.
That's it. You're all done. All right.
I'm good.
Fair enough. Well, again, I really enjoyed this. Thank you for nerding out with me. And you know what we say when you get out of here, right? Go Commando.
Go Commando.